My mother left me after my father's, leaving me with my stepfather and an inheritance of $10 million. When she found herself a new lover, she wanted to take the inheritance for herself. Hi, Reddit. I've been trying to piece together my past for years now, and I think it's time to share my story. Maybe putting it out there will help me figure things out, or at least make sense of it. Warning, it's a roller coaster, and I don't even know where to start. But here goes. I was born into what people would call privilege, but trust me, it didn't feel that way. My dad passed away when I was just a baby, too young to even remember him. Everyone told me he was a brilliant man, a genius even, who built his own business empire from scratch. He left me and my mom, Sophia, a massive inheritance, millions of dollars, the kind of money that could change lives. But honestly, I never felt rich. We lived in a big house in the suburbs, sure, but my mom was distant, even when I was little. Sophia, mom, feels weird to say sometimes, was complicated. She'd spend hours dressing me up for photo shoots, posting pictures on social media with captions like, "My little prince 2 hearts," but the moment the camera was off, she was back on the phone, talking about her next big opportunity. I didn't understand much back then, but I know now she was obsessed with some startup she wanted to launch. She wasn't a bad mom, per se, just distracted. All her energy went into chasing something intangible. My happiest memories are when she'd sit with me and tell me about my dad. She'd show me pictures of him, a tall man with kind eyes, always smiling. "He'd be so proud of you, Alex," she'd say, her voice soft for once. I'd ask her questions. What was he like? Did he love me? But her answers were vague, like she was reciting from a script. Still, I cherished those moments. They felt real. Things started to get weird when I turned 6. My mom was acting different, more frantic. She'd pace around the house, checking locks, whispering on the phone late at night. One day, she sat me down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. "Alex, honey," she said, forcing a smile, "you're going to stay with Uncle Steve for a little while. Just a few days, okay? Mommy has some things to take care of." I didn't even know I had an Uncle Steve. When I asked who he was, she hesitated. "He's your dad's brother. You'll like him. He's fun." Her voice was overly cheerful, like she was trying to convince herself. The next morning, she packed a small suitcase for me and drove me to this tiny, run-down house on the outskirts of town. Steve was waiting on the porch, smoking a cigarette. He was nothing like the uncles I'd seen on TV. No warm hugs or goofy jokes. He was tall and wiry, with a scruffy beard and a permanent scowl. "Here's your nephew," Mom said briskly, barely making eye contact with him. "Take care of him." She knelt down to my level, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "Be good, Alex. I'll be back soon." And then she was gone. Steve wasn't exactly the nurturing type. The first thing he said to me was, "Don't touch my stuff and we'll get along fine." He lived alone in this cluttered house that smelled like stale beer and old socks. The walls were lined with shelves full of dusty books and weird knickknacks, vintage clocks, porcelain figurines, even a stuffed owl. It was like a thrift store exploded in there. I spent most of my time in the tiny guest room he'd cleared out for me, reading the books I'd brought from home and trying not to cry. I didn't understand why my mom left me there. She promised it was temporary, but days turned into weeks, and she didn't come back. Every time I asked Steve about her, he'd shrug and say, "She'll be back when she's back." Stop whining. I hated him for that. But I also couldn't ignore the moments when he'd surprise me. Like the time he caught me staring at the old typewriter in his study. Instead of yelling at me for being nosy, he pulled it out, dusted it off, and said, "You want to try it?" It was your dad's. That typewriter became my escape. I'd sit there for hours, tapping away, making up stories about brave knights and daring adventurers. For a little while, I could pretend my life wasn't falling apart. The real turning point came about 3 months in. I was digging through some boxes in the attic, looking for something to do, when I found an old photo album. Flipping through it, I saw pictures of my dad, some with Steve, some with other people I didn't recognize. But what caught my eye was a picture of my mom with another man. They were at a party, laughing, his arm around her waist. The date on the back said it was taken 2 years after my dad died. My heart sank. Who was this guy? Why hadn't my mom ever mentioned him? I showed the picture to Steve, hoping for answers, but his reaction shocked me. He snatched the photo out of my hands, his face turning red. "You don't need to know about that," he snapped, stuffing it into his pocket. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions. Was my mom in trouble? Was that why she left me here? Or was she hiding something? Something about my dad? A week later, I overheard Steve on the phone. "No, she hasn't called," he said, his voice low and tense. "I told you, I don't know where she is. Look, if you want your money, take it up with her." Money? What money? And who was he talking to? The next morning, I confronted him. "What's going on, Uncle Steve? Why did my mom leave me here? And who were you talking to last night?" He glared at me, but I didn't back down. Finally, he sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "Look, kid, your mom, she's got issues. She's always chasing the next big thing, and she's not great with money. She owes some people, okay? Dangerous people. She left you here because she knew they wouldn't come looking for you. You're safer here." Safer. That word stuck with me. I wasn't just dumped on Steve because my mom was busy. She left me because she was running. From what? I still didn't know. Hey, Reddit. It's me again. I wrote about how my mom left me with Uncle Steve, promising it'd only be for a few days. Well, spoiler alert, it wasn't a few days. It was months, and things got worse. Way worse. If you've ever been in a situation where the ground keeps shifting under your feet, you'll understand how I felt. Let me tell you everything. When my mom first dropped me off, living with Steve didn't seem so bad. I mean, sure, the house was a mess, and he wasn't exactly friendly, but there was something almost exciting about it. He let me stay up late, watch whatever I wanted on TV, and eat junk food for dinner. For a kid who'd grown up with a mom obsessed with organic everything, it felt like freedom. Steve even showed me some cool stuff from his old collection. He had a bunch of vinyl records, a vintage camera, and even a dusty telescope. One night, he let me set it up in the backyard, and we spent hours looking at the stars. "That one's Orion," he said, pointing. "Your dad used to love stargazing." It was one of the only times he ever mentioned my dad. But the honeymoon phase didn't last long. After a couple of weeks, Steve's mood started to change. At first, it was little things. He'd snap at me for leaving my toys out or get annoyed if I asked too many questions. Then it escalated. One morning, I spilled some cereal on the floor. He exploded, yelling, "You're a goddamn burden. You know that? I didn't sign up for this." I froze, my cheeks burning with shame. It wasn't the first time I'd been yelled at, but something about the way he said burden cut deep. Steve's outbursts became more frequent, and I started avoiding him as much as possible. I'd stay in my room for hours, reading or drawing. Drawing became my escape. I wasn't great at it, but there was something soothing about putting pencil to paper, creating a world I could control. I'd sketch landscapes, animals, even imaginary characters, anything to take my mind off the tension in the house. One day, while rummaging through some old boxes in the attic, I found a sketchbook that belonged to my dad. It was filled with intricate drawings of buildings, machines, and landscapes. I felt an odd connection to him, like I was discovering a piece of him I never knew existed. I started trying to mimic his style, spending hours practicing. It became my sanctuary. Steve wasn't completely heartless, though. Sometimes, he'd surprise me. Like the time he brought home an old set of colored pencils he found at a thrift store. "Figured you might like these," he said gruffly, tossing them onto the kitchen table. It was a rare moment of kindness, and I clung to it. But those moments were rare. Most of the time, he was irritable and short-tempered. I couldn't figure out why. He wasn't working. He mostly stayed home, watching TV or tinkering with stuff in the garage. Sometimes, I'd hear him on the phone, arguing with someone. "I told you, I don't have the money," he'd shout, slamming the phone down. One night, everything came to a head. I was in my room, sketching, when I heard loud voices downstairs. At first, I thought Steve was yelling at the TV again, but then I realized there was another voice, a woman's. Curious, I crept to the top of the stairs and peeked down. A tall woman with red hair and a leather jacket was standing in the living room, her arms crossed. "You're way behind, Steve," she said coldly. You think you can keep dodging us forever? I told you. I just need more time, Steve replied, his voice strained. Time's up, she snapped. If you don't pay up, we'll take what's owed. And don't think the kid makes you untouchable. My stomach dropped. Were they talking about me? I must have made a noise because the woman looked up and spotted me. Her icy blue eyes locked onto mine, and she smirked. Cute kid, she said. Better hope your uncle gets his act together. Steve spun around, his face pale. Alex, go to your room, he barked. I didn't argue. I bolted back upstairs, my heart pounding. After that night, Steve was even more on edge. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was usually to snap at me for something trivial. I felt like I was walking on eggshells all the time. I tried asking him about the red-haired woman, but he just said, "None of your business," and changed the subject. The tension in the house was unbearable, so I started spending more time outside. There was a small park a few blocks away, and I'd go there to draw or read. One day, while I was sitting on a bench sketching, a boy about my age walked up to me. Cool drawing, he said, peering over my shoulder. His name was Max, and he lived nearby. He had wild, curly hair and an infectious laugh. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a friend. Max and I started hanging out almost every day. He introduced me to his little sister, Lily, and their dog, Rufus. Their house was the opposite of Steve's, warm, chaotic, and full of laughter. Max's mom always made me feel welcome, offering me snacks and asking how I was doing. I never told her the truth, but I think she could tell something was off. Back at Steve's house, things kept getting worse. One night, I heard him yelling on the phone again, but this time, he sounded desperate. I don't have it, he shouted. What do you want me to do? Sell the kid? My blood ran cold. He wouldn't really sell me, right? The next morning, I noticed something strange. My dad's old typewriter, the one Steve had let me use, was gone. When I asked him about it, he muttered something about needing to make ends meet. I didn't believe him. It felt like he was slowly selling off everything that connected me to my dad. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I came home from the park to find Steve sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot. You think you're so special, don't you? He slurred. Just because you've got that big inheritance waiting for you. Well, guess what, kid? Money doesn't fix everything. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen. Then he said something that changed everything. Your mom's not coming back, you know. She's gone. Probably dead. I ran to my room, tears streaming down my face. Was he telling the truth? Or was he just drunk and angry? Either way, it felt like my world was falling apart. Hi again. Reddit. It's me, Alex. If you've been following my story, you know it hasn't exactly been smooth sailing. But today, I want to share a chapter that gave me hope, a time when I found people who actually cared about me. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to have a real family. Let me tell you about Jessica and her family. High school wasn't exactly a fresh start, but it was different. After years of living with Steve and keeping my head down, I had learned how to blend in. I wasn't the loud kid in class or the one getting into trouble. I was just there. I showed up, did my work, and stayed out of the way. It wasn't like anyone at home cared about my grades or whether I had friends, so I didn't bother trying. That changed when I met Jessica. Jessica wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before. She had this energy about her, like she could walk into a room and make everyone feel at ease. We were paired together for a group project in English class, some lame presentation on of mice and men. I remember sitting in the library, awkwardly flipping through the book, while she sketched ideas in her notebook. She had these big, bright eyes that made it impossible not to look at her when she talked. Okay, so I'm thinking we do a scene reenactment, she said, her pencil flying across the page. You can be George, and I'll be Lenny. Trust me, it'll be hilarious. I was too stunned to argue. Sure, I mumbled. Jessica laughed. Don't sound too excited. That was how it started. One project turned into study sessions, which turned into lunch breaks together, which turned into her dragging me into her circle of friends. Jessica's friends were a mixed bag. Athletes, theater kids, band geeks. But they all had one thing in common. They were genuinely nice. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider. It was strange but good. And then there was Jessica's family. The first time she invited me over, I almost said no. Steve had drilled it into my head that other people's families were none of my business, and I didn't want to impose. But Jessica wouldn't take no for an answer. "Come on, Alex," she said, grabbing my arm. "My mom's making spaghetti, and she always makes enough to feed an army. You'll love it." Walking into Jessica's house was like stepping into another world. It smelled like garlic and fresh bread, and the walls were covered in family photos and cheesy inspirational quotes. Her mom, Karen, greeted me with a warm smile and a hug, even though we'd never met. Her dad, Mark, was in the kitchen, wearing an apron that said, "Kiss the cook." Her little brother, Ethan, was running around the living room in a Spider-Man costume, shouting something about saving the world. Dinner was chaos in the best way. Everyone talked over each other, laughing and joking, and no one seemed to mind when Ethan accidentally spilled his drink all over the table. Mark just grabbed a towel, ruffled Ethan's hair, and said, "No harm done, buddy." I couldn't stop staring. It was so different from what I was used to. After dinner, Karen pulled me aside. "You're welcome here anytime, Alex," she said, her voice kind. "Jessica talks about you all the time. You're a good kid." I didn't know what to say. No one had ever called me a good kid before. I mumbled a thank you, feeling my cheeks flush. That night when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about how warm and safe their house felt. It was the kind of home I didn't even know existed outside of TV shows. Over the next few months, I became a regular at Jessica's house. Her parents treated me like one of their own, always asking how school was going and making sure I had enough to eat. Karen even noticed my love for drawing and bought me a sketch pad and some pencils for my birthday. I almost cried when she handed it to me. "You've got talent, Alex," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." But it wasn't just the gifts or the food or the compliments. It was the little things, like how Mark would call me champ or how Ethan would beg me to play video games with him. It was the way they genuinely cared about me, even though they didn't have to. Not everything was perfect, though. Steve didn't like how much time I was spending with Jessica's family. "What are you, a charity case?" he sneered one night when I told him I'd be home late. "They don't care about you. They just feel sorry for you." I knew he was wrong, but his words still stung. Part of me couldn't help but wonder if he was right. Why would Jessica and her family care about someone like me? I didn't have anything to offer them. One day, I finally worked up the courage to ask Jessica. We were sitting in her room, listening to music, when I blurted it out. "Why do you care so much?" "About me, I mean." She looked at me like I just asked the dumbest question in the world. "Because you're my friend, Alex," she said simply. "And friends take care of each other. That's what family does." Family. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't felt like I had a family in years, but somehow, Jessica and her parents and even little Ethan had become mine. One night, something happened that solidified my place in their family. Jessica and I were working on a history project at her house when there was a knock at the door. Karen opened it, and to my horror, Steve was standing there. He looked furious. "Is Alex here?" he demanded, his voice slurring slightly. "I need to talk to him." Karen didn't flinch. "I think you should leave," she said firmly, stepping in front of him. "He's my nephew." Steve shouted. "You can't keep him from me." Mark appeared then, his broad frame filling the doorway. "You need to calm down, buddy," he said. "Alex is safe here. Go home." For a moment, I thought Steve was going to push past them, but then he muttered something under his breath and stormed off. Karen closed the door, her hands shaking. "Are you okay, Alex?" she asked, pulling me into a hug. I nodded, too stunned to speak. That night, as I lay on their couch under a warm blanket, I realized something. I didn't have to face the world alone anymore. I had people who cared about me, people who would stand up for me, no matter what. Hey, Reddit. It's Alex again. I've been sharing pieces of my story, and this next part is complicated. When I was 17, I thought I had finally found some stability in my life. Jessica and her family had become my second home, and I was starting to imagine a future that didn't revolve around fear or uncertainty. But then my mom came back, and she wasn't alone. It happened on a random Tuesday. I'd just gotten home from school and was halfway through a sandwich when Steve called me into the living room. His tone was sharp, almost urgent. I thought I was in trouble for something, but when I walked in, I saw her. My mom. She was standing in the middle of the room, looking almost exactly the same as I remembered. Same blonde hair, same piercing green eyes, but something about her felt off. Maybe it was the expensive-looking coat she was wearing, or the way she held her designer purse like it was a shield. "Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "It's me. It's Mom." I froze. I didn't know what to say, what to feel. Part of me wanted to run to her, to bury my face in her shoulder and cry. But another part, the part that remembered being left with Steve and forgotten, wanted to scream at her to leave. Behind her stood a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and a smug smile that instantly set me on edge. "This is Mark," my mom said, gesturing to him. "My husband." Husband? The room felt like it was spinning. I barely heard what she said next. Something about wanting to reconnect, about how sorry she was for everything. Steve cut her off with a snort. "Took you long enough," he muttered, lighting a cigarette. "Steve, please," my mom said, her voice sharp. "I'm here now. That's what matters." "Is it?" I thought, because it didn't feel that way. Mark stepped forward then, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you, Alex," he said, his smile too perfect. "I've heard so much about you." I didn't take his hand. The next few weeks were awkward. My mom and Mark rented a house nearby, and she kept trying to spend time with me. At first, I resisted. I didn't trust her, not after everything. But Jessica convinced me to give her a chance. "People change, Alex," she said. "Maybe she really does want to make things right." So I gave in. I started meeting her for lunch or coffee, and sometimes Mark tagged along. He was always overly friendly, asking questions about school and my hobbies, but something about him felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. My mom, on the other hand, seemed genuinely different. She asked about my drawings, about Jessica, even about Steve. For a while, I started to believe she really wanted to rebuild our relationship. But then the conversation shifted. It started subtly. Mark would drop hints about my dad's inheritance, asking if I knew how much was left or if it was being managed properly. My mom never said anything directly, but she'd give him these looks, like she was urging him to be careful. One afternoon, Mark invited me to their house for dinner. I almost said no, but my mom insisted, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful. Their place was the complete opposite of Steve's, modern, spotless, and filled with expensive furniture. After dinner, Mark brought out a bottle of wine. "Just a small glass," he said with a wink, pouring one for me. I didn't usually drink, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I took a sip. That's when he brought it up again. "You know, Alex," he said, swirling his wine glass, "your dad left you quite a fortune. It must feel amazing, knowing your future is secure." I shrugged, not liking where this was going. "I don't really think about it." "You should," he pressed. "It's a huge responsibility. Managing that kind of money isn't easy, especially for someone your age." My mom chimed in then, her tone soft but insistent. "He's right, Alex. Maybe it's time we started talking about your plans for the inheritance. Mark has a lot of experience with investments. He could help you." There it was, the real reason they'd come back. I excused myself to the bathroom, my hands shaking. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to calm down. Was I overreacting? Maybe they really did just want to help. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Not for a second. When I got back to the table, Mark was scrolling through something on his phone. "I was thinking," he said, not looking up, "we could set up a trust fund. That way, the money is protected, and you can access it when you're older. What do you think?" "I think I'm fine the way things are," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Mark looked taken aback, but my mom jumped in. "Alex, honey, we're just trying to look out for you. This isn't something you should handle alone." "I'm not alone," I shot back. "Steve's been taking care of it." That shut them up. After that night, things between us were tense. My mom kept trying to act like nothing had happened, but Mark wasn't as subtle. He started showing up unannounced, finding excuses to talk about financial planning, or long-term goals. It was exhausting. Jessica noticed something was wrong. "You've been quiet lately," she said one day as we walked home from school. "What's going on?" I told her everything, about my mom, Mark, the inheritance. She listened without interrupting, her face growing more serious with every word. "That's sketchy," she said when I finished. "They disappear for years and then come back, acting all nice. Just when you're about to turn 18? Something's off." I knew she was right, but I didn't know what to do. Things came to a head on my 18th birthday. My mom threw a party at their house, inviting a bunch of people I barely knew. Mark gave a speech, going on and on about how proud he was of me and how excited he was for my future. After the party, he pulled me aside. "Alex," he said, his tone serious, "now that you're an adult, it's time to make some decisions about your inheritance. Your mom and I just want to make sure you're protected." I couldn't take it anymore. "Why do you care so much about my money?" I snapped. "If you're really here for me, then prove it. Stop bringing it up." Mark's face darkened, but before he could say anything, my mom stepped in. "Alex, don't talk to him like that," she said, her voice sharp. "We're your family. We deserve a little trust." "Family?" I laughed bitterly. "You left me with Steve for 10 years and never looked back. And now you expect me to trust you? Give me a break." The room went silent. My mom looked like I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. I walked out, slamming the door behind me. That night, I went to Jessica's house and told her everything. Her parents were furious when they heard what had happened. "You're staying here tonight," Karen said firmly. No arguments. Mark and my mom tried to call me, but I ignored them. For the first time, I felt like I had control over my life. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me. "Hey, Reddit. It's Alex again." I thought I was finally done with my mom and her husband, Mark, but life had other plans. What I'm about to share is the hardest thing I've ever gone through. It's the story of how I found out just how far some people will go for money, and how I fought back. It started with a slip-up, a careless moment that shattered what little trust one had left in my mom and Mark. I'd been at their house one afternoon, waiting for my mom to drive me home. Mark wasn't supposed to be there, but he walked in while she was upstairs. "Hey, Alex," he said, his tone too casual. "Waiting for your mom?" "Yeah," I muttered, not looking up from my phone. He hovered for a moment before walking into the next room. I should have ignored it, but something about the way he was acting made me pause. I waited a few seconds, then crept toward the door. I could hear him talking, low and urgent, on the phone. "I'm telling you, we need to move fast," he said. "The kid's turning 18 soon. If we don't lock this down, we're screwed." My heart stopped. Was he talking about me? I didn't hear the rest of the conversation because my mom came downstairs, but that one sentence was enough to light a fire in me. I had to know what they were planning. The next time I went to their house, I came prepared. I downloaded a voice recording app on my phone and kept it running in my pocket. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I couldn't confront them without proof. It didn't take long to get what I needed. While pretending to do homework in the dining room, I overheard them in the kitchen. "Mark, the trust fund is airtight, but there's always a way around these things. We just need him to sign something." "Mom, you think he'll agree? He's been so distant lately." "Mark, that's why we need to play this carefully. Make him think it's for his own good." My stomach churned. They were plotting to manipulate me into giving up control of my inheritance. I spent the next week recording every suspicious conversation I could. The more I listened, the worse it got. They weren't just trying to gain control. They were planning to drain the money, using it for Mark's failed business ventures and God knows what else. I shared the recordings with Jessica one night after school. We sat in her room, listening to the voices of my mom and Mark through her laptop speakers. "This is insane," Jessica said, her face pale. "They're literally trying to steal from you." "I know," I said, my voice shaking. "But what can I do? It's their word against mine." Jessica thought for a moment, then said, "Not if we expose them. We just need a solid plan." Jessica was a force to be reckoned with. Over the next few days, she helped me come up with a strategy to catch them in the act. First, we needed more evidence, something undeniable. Then, we'd take it to someone who could actually help, like a lawyer or the police. I started planting bait. During one visit, I casually mentioned that I was thinking about setting up a trust fund myself. Mark's eyes lit up like a Christmas tree. "That's a great idea," he said, his voice dripping with enthusiasm. "I know someone who could help with that." "Really?" I said, trying to sound interested. "Maybe we can talk about it next time." From that moment on, they ramped up their efforts. Mark started showing me documents, talking about how complicated managing money could be and how he and my mom just wanted to take the pressure off me. I played along, recording every word. The breakthrough came during a family dinner. They'd invited me over to celebrate my upcoming graduation, but it was just another excuse to push their agenda. "We've been talking," Mark said, sliding a folder across the table. "This is a draft of the trust agreement. Take your time reviewing it, but I think you'll find it's the best option for everyone." I opened the folder, pretending to read. It was full of legal jargon I didn't understand, but one thing was clear. Signing it would give them full control of the inheritance. "I'll think about it," I said, slipping the folder into my bag. That night, Jessica and I went over the documents. Her dad, who worked as an accountant, helped us decipher the fine print. "This is a scam," he said bluntly. "They're trying to cut you out completely." With everything we'd gathered, we decided it was time to act. Jessica's dad recommended a lawyer he trusted, and we made an appointment to share what we'd found. The lawyer, Mr. Harper, was a no-nonsense guy with a sharp eye for detail. After listening to the recordings and reviewing the documents, he said, "This is more than enough to build a case. But if you really want to expose them, you'll need to confront them directly." While recording, of course. The idea terrified me, but I knew he was right. The confrontation happened a few days later. I invited my mom and Mark to a coffee shop, telling them I wanted to talk about the trust fund. Jessica came with me for moral support, sitting a few tables away with her phone ready to record. When they arrived, I didn't waste any time. "I've been thinking a lot about what you've been saying," I began, keeping my voice steady. "But I need to know the truth. Why are you so interested in my inheritance?" My mom looked flustered, but Mark jumped in smoothly. "We just want what's best for you, Alex," he said. "This is about protecting your future." "Really?" I said, pulling out my phone. "Because it sounds like you're planning to take everything for yourselves." I hit play on one of the recordings. Their voices filled the air, clear and unmistakable. My mom's face turned white, and Mark's expression hardened. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "You're twisting our words." "Am I?" I said, pulling out the folder he'd given me. "Because this document says otherwise." They tried to deny everything, but it was too late. Jessica sent the recordings to Mr. Harper, who helped me file a formal complaint. The case quickly gained traction, and soon, my mom and Mark were facing legal action for attempted fraud. The fallout was messy. My mom begged me to drop the case, crying about how she just wanted to make things right, but I couldn't forgive her. Not this time. Jessica and her family stood by me through it all, proving once again that they were my real support system. And for the first time in years, I felt free. After gathering all the evidence with Jessica's help, I knew it was time to confront my mom and Mark. But I wasn't going in alone. Jessica's dad, Mr. Carter, who was both a CPA and a practical genius with financial matters, agreed to join me. He wasn't just there for moral support. He came armed with a legal understanding of how they were trying to manipulate me. We arranged the meeting at my mom and Mark's house. I chose the location intentionally. I wanted them to feel like they were in control, at least at first. My mom greeted me at the door with her usual overly sweet smile, but Mark's expression was more guarded. "Alex, honey, it's so good to see you," my mom said, pulling me into a hug. I stepped back, avoiding her gaze. "We need to talk," I said. "This is Mr. Carter, Jessica's dad. He's here to help explain some things." Mark's smile faltered. "Explain what?" "Why don't we sit down?" I suggested, motioning toward the living room. The tension in the room was thick as we settled into our seats. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the coffee table, the screen displaying the voice recording app. "Before we start," I said, looking directly at Mark, "I need to ask you something. Were you ever going to be honest with me about your plans for my inheritance?" Mark's face darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about." I think you do, I said, pressing play on one of the recordings. The room filled with the sound of their voices. Mark, we just need him to sign something. Once we have access, we'll move the money around. He'll never notice. Mom, but what if he finds out? He's not stupid, Mark. Mark, he's a kid. He'll believe whatever we tell him. My mom's face turned ashen. Alex, it's not what it sounds like, she stammered. Really? I said, my voice rising. Because it sounds like you were planning to steal everything my dad left me. Mark leaned forward, his expression hard. You have no idea what you're talking about, kid. This is all a misunderstanding. Mr. Carter, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. Actually, it's not. I've reviewed the documents you provided, and there's clear intent to defraud Alex of his inheritance. This isn't just a misunderstanding. It's illegal. Mark exploded. Illegal? You're kidding me. This little brat wouldn't even have this money if it weren't for his dad. He's done nothing to earn it. I stood up, shaking with anger. My dad worked his entire life to build something for me. And you, both of you, were going to take it. Don't act like this is about what I've earned. This is about your greed. My mom started crying, but it felt rehearsed. Alex, please, you have to understand. We were just trying to help you. We didn't mean for it to get this far. Help me? I said, laughing bitterly. You left me with Steve for 10 years, and now you show up out of nowhere, saying it's all for my benefit? I don't believe you. Mark glared at me. You're throwing away the only family you have left. Good luck making it on your own. The fallout was immediate. I filed an official complaint with the help of Mr. Carter and my lawyer. The recordings, along with the forged documents, made it clear that Mark and my mom were attempting to commit fraud. Legal proceedings were initiated, and they were forced to back down. My mom begged me to forgive her. She called, texted, even showed up at Jessica's house, sobbing and pleading. I'm still your mother, she said through tears. Please, Alex, don't do this. But I couldn't. I had given her so many chances, and each time, she'd chosen herself over me. This time, I had to choose myself. Don't contact me again, I said. We're done. Mark, on the other hand, was unapologetic. You're nothing without that money, he sneered when I saw him for the last time. Enjoy your lonely little life. I didn't bother responding. I just walked away. For a while, I felt lost. Cutting ties with my mom felt like severing the last thread connecting me to my old life. But as the weeks passed, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I had Jessica and her family, who had stood by me through everything. They didn't care about my money or my past. They cared about me. One night, I was sitting on the couch at Jessica's house, watching a movie with her and Ethan, when Karen walked in with a tray of cookies. How's my second son doing? She asked, smiling warmly. I couldn't help but smile back. Pretty good, I said. It hit me then. Family isn't about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who love you for who you are, not what you have. Jessica and her family had done that for me, and I was finally ready to let them in fully. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from my mom's manipulation, from Mark's schemes, and from the weight of the past. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I wasn't facing it alone.